In the heart of Manhattan, where ambition is the currency and prestige the ultimate prize, lies a sanctuary of culinary art known as La Scultura. It was more than a restaurant. It was a curated experience. The walls were adorned with museum-quality replicas of Renaissance sculptures. The lighting was masterfully orchestrated to evoke the soft glow of a Florentine evening. And the air itself seemed thick with the aroma of aged Parmesan, fresh basil, and old money. For the patrons, it was a stage upon which they performed their lives of effortless luxury. For Isabella Rossi, it was a battlefield. At 23, Isabella moved through this opulent theater with a quiet efficiency that was both an art form and a survival mechanism. Her uniform, a simple but elegant black dress with a crisp white apron, was her armor. Her smile, polite and professionally distant, was her shield. To the diners, she was a pair of hands, a fleeting presence that anticipated their needs before they were spoken. A refilled water glass, a fresh set of silverware, the silent clearing of a finished course. They saw the waitress, but they never saw Isabella. They didn't see the art history scholar, a top student at NYU, just one semester away from completing her master's thesis on the iconographic significance of shadow in the works of Caravaggio. They didn't see the girl who spent her meager free hours lost in the dusty archives of the university library, her fingers tracing the faded lines of 16th century prints. They didn't see the devoted granddaughter who rushed home after her grueling 10-hour shifts to a small rent-controlled apartment in Queens to care for her nonna, whispering to her in the soft, musical Florentine dialect of their ancestors. This job, this world of clinking crystal and hushed conversations, was a necessary purgatory, the price she paid for her dreams and her devotion. Her daily crucible was populated by a cast of characters as predictable as the setting sun. There was Marco, the manager, a man whose passion for Italian cuisine was matched only by his terror of a negative Yelp review. He prowled the dining floor like a nervous panther, his sharp eyes missing nothing, from a fingerprint on a wine glass to a wilted leaf of arugula. To Marco, the staff were soldiers, and a complaint from a high-profile table was a catastrophic defeat. Then there was Chloe, a fellow waitress who had been at La Scultura for 3 years and viewed her seniority as a license for cruelty. With eyes as sharp as her acrylic nails, she saw Isabella's quiet competence not as an asset to the team, but as a personal affront. Chloe moved through life with the zero-sum conviction that for her to rise, someone else had to fall. She would accidentally forget to tell Isabella about a table's allergy, or she would misdirect a busboy to clear Isabella's table before the guests were finished, creating awkward chaos for which Isabella would inevitably be blamed. Isabella bore these small-caliber attacks with a stoic grace that seemed only to fuel Chloe's resentment. On this particular Thursday evening, the atmosphere in La Scultura was charged with an electric tension. A reservation had been made that morning under a name that echoed through the New York real estate world like a thunderclap: Sterling Davenport. Marco had gathered the evening staff for a tense pre-shift briefing in the cramped kitchen, the scent of simmering marinara sauce doing little to calm their nerves. "Listen up," he'd said, his voice tight. "Sterling Davenport is dining with us tonight. Table 14, the Grand Corner booth. He's with a party of 4, including 2 business associates from Milan. This is not a drill. I want perfection. Not just good service. Not just great service. I want flawless, invisible, mind-reading service. One mistake, one spilled drop of wine, and it's my head, and whoever is responsible will be looking for a new job tomorrow." His eyes scanned the anxious faces before landing, with grim finality, on Isabella. "Rossi, you're on table 14. A collective silent breath was sucked out of the room. Chloe shot Isabella a look that was a venomous cocktail of sadistic glee and feigned pity. Table 14, with a guest like Davenport, was the restaurant's equivalent of being sent over the top of the trench. It was Marco's way of testing his best soldier, or perhaps setting her up for a spectacular fall. "Sir, are you sure?" Isabella asked, her voice calm, betraying none of the sudden pounding in her chest. "Chloe has more experience with our more demanding clientele." Marco's lips thinned. "I'm sure, Rossi. Your Italian is the best in the house. I want his associates to feel comfortable. Don't make me regret this." Chloe turned away, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she began polishing a fork with ferocious intensity. Isabella felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just about a difficult guest. It was about survival. It was about the tips that would cover next month's rent, pay for the expensive art books she needed for her thesis, and afford her Nona's heart medication. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of her apron, and prepared for the storm. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with agonizing slowness towards 8 o'clock. Precisely at 8, the arrival of the Davenport party silenced the low hum of the restaurant. Sterling Davenport did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. He was a man in his early 60s, with a mane of perfectly coiffed silver hair and a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed to have been woven directly onto his formidable frame. His face was a mask of cold patrician authority, but it was his eyes that commanded the room. Pale, calculating chips of blue ice that assessed, valued, and dismissed everything they saw in a single sweeping glance. By his side, practically attached to his arm, was his daughter, Tiffany Davenport. At 22, she was a caricature of heiress chic, draped in a designer dress that cost more than Isabella's annual tuition. Her blonde hair was a masterpiece of salon engineering. Her makeup was flawless, and her expression was one of bored, congenital disdain. She clutched a tiny jewel-encrusted handbag like a royal scepter, her eyes darting around the room, not with curiosity, but with the appraising gaze of someone deciding what to buy and what to discard. Trailing them were two older, impeccably dressed Italian men, their faces polite, but their eyes watchful. Marco greeted them with a bow that was almost comically deferential. "Mr. Davenport, a pleasure, an absolute honor to welcome you back to La Scultura." Davenport gave a curt nod, his gaze already moving past Marco to the table. "My usual booth, I trust." "Of course, sir. Right this way." As Marco led the procession to the best table in the house, he gestured towards Isabella, who was approaching with menus. "And this is Isabella, Mr. Davenport. She will be your server this evening. She is one of our finest." Isabella offered a serene professional smile. "Good evening, gentlemen, Miss Davenport. Welcome to La Scultura." Sterling Davenport barely acknowledged her existence. The two Italian associates gave her polite, brief nods, but Tiffany's eyes lingered on her. It was not a look of recognition, but of classification. The gaze was a swift, dismissive scan, from her simple black shoes to her neatly tied back hair, that filed her away under the category of the help. She took the menu from Isabella's hand without a word, her long, manicured nails brushing against Isabella's skin. The touch was like ice. The tone for the evening was set. Tiffany, it quickly became clear, intended to be the star of the show. She had apparently taken a semester of Italian at a liberal arts college and was determined to prove her worldliness to her father's Milanese partners. She began by addressing Isabella exclusively in loud, excruciatingly bad Italian. "Cameriera!" she called out, using the slightly déclassé term for waitress instead of the more polite signorina. "Vorrei, un bicchiere di vino, il più costoso." She wanted a glass of the most expensive wine, a request delivered with the grammatical finesse of a toddler. Isabella responded in gentle, perfect Italian. "Certamente, signorina. Abbiamo un eccellente Super Tuscan al bicchiere, il sassy del 2015. È una scelta superba." "Certainly, miss. We have an excellent Super Tuscan by the glass, the 2015 Sassicaia. It's a superb choice." Tiffany blinked, not quite understanding the fluid response. Si, quello." She waved her hand dismissively, as if Isabella's fluency were an annoying affectation. The meal proceeded as a master class in passive aggression, with Tiffany as the conductor. She questioned the provenance of the olive oil. She insisted on explaining the menu to the actual Italians at the table, getting nearly every regional specialty wrong. She sent back her risotto ai funghi, claiming the arborio rice was too ricey. Each complaint was a performance, a small assertion of her dominance over the quiet, efficient girl serving her. Through it all, Isabella remained a bastion of professional composure. She apologized gracefully, replaced the risotto without argument, and answered every mangled Italian question with patience and clarity. She felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the effort of maintaining a serene mask, while her intelligence was being so crudely and publicly insulted. She was a ghost in the machine of their evening, a functional object whose inner life was of less consequence than the temperature of their soup. She could feel Chloe's eyes on her from across the room, a vulture enjoying the spectacle. The main courses had been served. Sterling Davenport and his associates were deep in a discussion about zoning permits and leveraged buyouts. Tiffany, ignored and bored, turned her attention back to her favorite target. She was trying to recount a story about a recent family trip to Florence. And we were in the big museum with the statue of David, she explained to the Italians, who looked on with pained smiles. And we saw this amazing painting. It was so dark. And there was this woman, and she was cutting off a guy's head. It was by, Botticelli, I think. One of the Italian men gently interjected. Forse Caravaggio, signorina? Giuditta che decapita Oloferni? Yes, whatever, Tiffany snapped, annoyed at being corrected. She looked around for a distraction, and her eyes landed on Isabella, who was silently refilling her father's water glass. At that exact moment, one of the Italian gentlemen, gesturing with his hands as he spoke, accidentally nudged a bread plate. The plate tipped, and a single buttered bread roll tumbled off the table, landing silently on the plush carpet. The world seemed to grind to a halt. It was nothing, a trifle, an insignificant spill. But for Tiffany, it was the opportunity she had been waiting for. It was a flaw in the perfect service, a crack in Isabella's armor. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked down at the fallen roll with an expression of theatrical horror, as if a sewer rat had just scurried across her feet. Then, with a sigh of profound, long-suffering disgust, she turned to her father and his guests. Believing herself to be perfectly safe, shielded by the perceived ignorance of the American waitress standing beside her, she switched to what she thought was scathing, sophisticated Italian. The words that spilled from her lips were not just incorrect. They were a grotesque collage of grammatical errors and mispronounced slurs, dripping with a venom that was unmistakable in any language. Guarda questa stupida contadina, she spat out, her voice a low, vicious hiss. In English, her intended meaning was, look at this stupid peasant girl. They hire these clumsy morons who can't even keep the table clean. She's probably not smart enough to pour water without making a mess. She's an incompetent fool, not fit to serve pigs. The two Italian men stiffened, their faces flushing with embarrassment. Sterling Davenport, who understood a little Italian, raised an eyebrow at his daughter's crude outburst. They all instinctively glanced at Isabella, expecting to see a confused, apologetic girl, blissfully unaware of the content of the insult, only its angry tone. They had no idea that for Isabella, it was not a secret. Every ugly, mangled word, every misplaced accent, every grammatical train wreck had landed not on deaf ears, but in a mind that understood their structure, their nuance, and their brutal, hateful intent with devastating, scholarly clarity. The shield of her professionalism didn't just crack, it vaporized. The Italian words, ugly and sharp, hung in the air like poison darts. To anyone else, it might have been the sound of a spoiled young woman having a tantrum, but to Isabella, it was a declaration of war. Stupida contadina. Stupid peasant girl. The insult was a deliberate surgical strike, aimed at her intelligence, her heritage, and her dignity. It was the culmination of every condescending glance, every backhanded compliment from Chloe, every moment she had been forced to smile while biting her tongue to pay for a dream Tiffany Davenport could never even comprehend. For a long, suspended moment, she did nothing. She simply stood there, the silver water pitcher still in her hand, her face an unreadable mask of perfect neutrality. Inside, a glacial rage was solidifying, cold and pure. Tiffany, reveling in the moment, watched her, a smug, contemptuous smirk on her face. She was waiting for Isabella to scurry away in shame, to fetch a busboy to clean up the mess. She was about to wave her hand and dismiss her. But that is not what happened. A subtle shift occurred in Isabella's posture. Her spine, which had been held in the slightly deferential posture of a server, straightened. It was a small movement, but it transformed her entire presence from one of servitude to one of absolute regal authority. Her chin lifted. The polite, vacant smile vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, chilling calm. She deliberately placed the water pitcher on a nearby service stand, her movements unhurried, graceful, and precise. Then she turned her head slowly and looked directly at Tiffany Davenport. Her eyes, which Tiffany had dismissed as brown and unremarkable, were now lit from within by a formidable intelligence. They were dark, piercing, and locked onto Tiffany's with an unnerving intensity. The two Italian associates felt the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. Marco, sensing a Category 5 disaster, began power-walking towards the table from across the room, his face a mask of pure panic. He was ready to intervene, to apologize, to offer a lifetime supply of free tiramisu, to fire Isabella on the spot. He was far too late. The silence had stretched just long enough to become a taut, vibrating wire. It was Isabella who finally cut it. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it sliced through the restaurant's ambient chatter with the clarity of a church bell. She did not address Tiffany in English. She spoke in perfect, eloquent, Florentine Italian, the dialect of Dante and Michelangelo, a language so pure and beautiful that it made Tiffany's earlier attempts sound like nails on a chalkboard. In English, what she said was, "Miss, your assumption that my position in this establishment reflects my intelligence is as poorly constructed as your command of the subjunctive mood. One does not use the indicative when expressing a hypothetical. It is a common but vulgar mistake." She paused, letting the perfectly articulated words settle in the stunned silence. She then turned her gaze slightly to the two Milanese gentlemen. Furthermore, she continued in the same flawless Italian, "Speaking of vulgar mistakes, the painter you were struggling to identify was not Botticelli, whose work is characterized by a lyrical, Neoplatonic grace. The painting you described, Judith beheading Holofernes, is one of two versions by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. The one in Florence at the Uffizi Gallery is the earlier, more theatrically brutal version from 1599. It is a masterpiece of tenebrism, a study in the violent psychology of the human condition, where the divine light illuminates not piety, but the grim reality of the act. Judith's determined expression, contrasted with the horror on the face of her maidservant, Abra, is a complex commentary on female agency and moral ambiguity. A subject, I imagine, that is quite beyond your grasp." She delivered the entire speech without a trace of anger. Her tone was cool, academic, and utterly devastating. She had not only understood Tiffany's insult, she had grammatically corrected it, delivered a university-level art history lecture, and then dismissed her with the cool precision of a surgeon. The effect was apocalyptic. Tiffany Davenport's face, which had been a mask of smug arrogance, seemed to crumble. Her jaw fell open. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a blotchy, mottled pallor. Her eyes, for the first time that evening, showed not disdain, but pure, unadulterated horror. It was the look of a playground bully who had just tried to punch a quiet girl, only to discover that the quiet girl was a heavyweight boxing champion. The two Italian executives stared, their jaws slack. They looked from Isabella to Tiffany and back again, their faces a mixture of shock and unconcealed admiration. This waitress, this quiet American girl, had just intellectually annihilated a billionaire's daughter in the language of their birth. From across the room, Chloe's jaw dropped so far she almost unhinged it. The fork she was polishing slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Even Marco, who had skidded to a halt a few feet away, stood frozen, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the universal language of complete and total humiliation. The silence that followed was no longer just uncomfortable. It was a physical presence, a vacuum that had sucked all the air and noise out of the room. In that moment, in the opulent heart of La Scultura, Isabella Rossi, a waitress in a simple black dress, held the entire room, and Tiffany Davenport's shattered ego in the palm of her hand. The invitation, or rather the command, did not so much break the silence as it shattered it, leaving razor-sharp fragments of disbelief hanging in the air. a billionaire asking a waitress to join him at his table. It was a transgression against the natural order of things, a disruption of the rigid caste system that was the unspoken law of la scultura, the carefully constructed universe of patrons and servers, of the seen and the unseen, had been irrevocably fractured. Isabella stood at the epicenter of this fracture, a fixed point in a swirling vortex of shock, caught between the apoplectic face of her manager and the unnervingly calm gaze of the most formidable man she had ever met. He was the architect of her humiliation, and now with the casual authority of a king, he was offering her a seat at his court. The fallout was not just beginning, it was cascading. The invitation to sit was so outlandish, so profoundly contrary to the sacred, unspoken scripture of service industry hierarchy, that for a long moment, nobody moved. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding a collective breath. Isabella's eyes fell upon the empty velvet chair, an object suddenly imbued with an impossible weight. It was no longer a piece of furniture, it was a crossroads, a question, a dare. Her mind, a moment ago a finely honed weapon of linguistic precision, was now a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. Was this another, more sophisticated test? A trap laid with the silken threads of etiquette, designed to humiliate her in a more intimate, more devastating arena? To sit would be an act of insubordination against her manager, her job, her station. To refuse would be an act of defiance against a man who did not seem to tolerate defiance. She felt the burning stares of every diner, every staff member, dissecting her, judging her, waiting for her next move on this suddenly very public chessboard. Marco, the manager, finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled sputtering. "Mr. Davenport, I must insist, this is highly irregular. She is on duty. Staff are strictly not permitted to fraternize with—" "She is on duty for me," Davenport cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. The words were not shouted but delivered with the chilling quiet of absolute power. He did not even grant Marco a glance. His focus remained locked on Isabella. "And I am now conducting what has become a private business meeting. I trust my privacy will be respected." His gaze then shifted, sweeping over his now silent daughter and her stunned companions. "Tiffany, gentlemen, perhaps you would like to go and inspect the dessert cart. It is over there, at the bar. Take your time." It was a dismissal as clean and brutal as a guillotine. The two Italian men, whose faces had been masks of pained politeness, now looked profoundly grateful, as if they had just been granted a royal pardon. They rose from their chairs with an alacrity that bordered on desperate, murmuring, hasty pleasantries as they practically fled the supercharged atmosphere of the table. Tiffany, however, remained rooted to her seat, her face a thunderous canvas of crimson fury and shattered pride. "Daddy, you cannot be serious. After what she did, she—" "Now, Tiffany," Sterling said. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous octave, a resonant hum of authority that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It was the voice that dismantled corporations and silenced boardrooms. Tiffany flinched as if physically struck, the words dying in her throat. Her mouth snapped shut, her perfectly painted lips forming a thin, white line. She shot Isabella a look of such concentrated hatred it felt like a physical blow, then stood with a jerk, her chair scraping angrily against the floor, and stormed away toward the bar, a queen exiled from her own court. Davenport's icy blue eyes, now cleared of all familial distractions, returned to Isabella. The intensity of his focus was unnerving. It was the look of a scientist studying a fascinating, unexpected specimen. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice now a neutral, almost gentle tone. "Please." Her training, her instincts, a lifetime of learning to be polite and unobtrusive, screamed at her to decline, to apologize, to melt back into the shadows where she belonged. That was the safe path, the path of survival. But another voice, a stronger, more defiant impulse that had been awakened tonight, rose to quell the fear. It was the voice of the scholar, the granddaughter, the woman who had just been called a stupid peasant girl. He had started this. He had dragged her out of the shadows and into this bizarre, glaring spotlight. She would not scurry back now. She would see it through. With a quiet grace that was a stark contrast to the violent turmoil inside her, Isabella Rossi pulled out the heavy velvet chair and sat down. She did not slouch or shrink. She sat with her back ramrod straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, a portrait of unnerving composure. Across the dining room, Chloe watched, her mouth physically agape, a half-polished wineglass frozen in her hand. This was an aberration, a glitch in the matrix of her world. Isabella was supposed to be fired, shamed, sent home in tears to her pathetic little life. Instead, she was sitting at the most powerful table in the restaurant, opposite the most powerful man, as if she were his equal. A venomous, acidic jealousy, so sharp and hot it felt like it might dissolve her from the inside out, flooded Chloe's veins. For a few long, unnerving moments, Davenport simply studied Isabella from across the vast expanse of the white linen tablecloth. He was taking her measure, his analytical gaze missing nothing. "You are not what you seem, Miss Rossi," he finally said, his English precise and unaccented. "Few people are, Mr. Davenport," she replied, her voice steady, revealing none of the adrenaline coursing through her. "Touché," he conceded. A ghost of a smile, thin and sharp as a razor, touched his lips but did not travel to his eyes. "Your Italian is more than fluent. It is cultured, academic. Why are you here in this place, serving overpriced pasta to people like my daughter?" It was the question that haunted her every waking moment, the central, defining paradox of her existence. She had debated it in the darkest hours of the night, when the ache in her feet was a dull throb, and the weight of her ambition felt like a physical burden. She chose the simple, unadorned truth, wielding it like a shield. Because a master's degree in art history from NYU, particularly with a focus on the humanities, does not come with a trust fund, sir. Scholarships help, but they do not cover the cost of living in this city, nor the expense of caring for one's family. This is an honorable job. It allows me to pursue my studies and fulfill my obligations. It pays the bills. She said the words with a quiet dignity that was, in itself, a silent rebuke to his world's gilded, effortless values. "Honor does not leverage assets," he countered immediately, dismissing the sentiment with an impatient wave of his hand, as if brushing away a cobweb. "Intellect does. Courage does. You displayed both tonight. Those are not sentimental virtues, Miss Rossi. They are commodities. They are assets I understand, and they are assets I invest in." Isabella remained silent, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her posture unwavering. She was not a commodity to be assessed. She would wait. She would let him reveal his purpose. "My company, Davenport Holding," he began, leaning forward, the vast table shrinking between them as his intensity created its own gravitational pull, "is in the final stages of acquiring a portfolio of historic properties throughout Italy. The crown jewel of this portfolio is the Palazzo de' Medici in Florence, a magnificent, sprawling 15th century building that has, tragically, fallen into a state of profound disrepair. We intend to convert it into our flagship European hotel, a testament to both Renaissance history and modern luxury. The restoration is a delicate, multi-billion-dollar project. The Italian government is watching our every move. The global art historical community is sharpening its knives, ready to crucify us if we make a single misstep, if a single fresco is improperly restored." He paused, his gaze boring into her, gauging her reaction. "My people in Italy are the best architects and engineers money can buy. They are brilliant, but they see a fresco by Gozzoli, and they think in terms of plaster density, moisture levels, and structural integrity. They don't understand the meaning. They lack the nuance, the soul. I need a bridge. I don't need another overpaid translator who can swap words from one language to another like a machine. I have dozens of those. I need someone who understands the very soul of the culture, someone who can read the subtext in a heated negotiation with a stubborn government minister from the Soprintendenza, someone who can stand in front of a damaged work of art and tell the difference between a real Botticelli and a clever fake by one of his students, and then turn around and explain that crucial difference to me in plain, actionable English. I need an interpreter of culture, Miss Rossi, not just of language." The implication hung in the air between them, vast and shimmering with impossible possibility. Isabella's heart, which had been beating a steady, defiant rhythm, began to pound with a new, terrifying, and utterly seductive emotion. Hope. It was a dangerous, intoxicating feeling. "I am offering you a position at Davenport Holding," he said, and the words delivered in his calm, measured tone dropped like stones into the silent pool of her life, sending shockwaves out to its furthest shores. "You would work directly with my European development team. Your title will be Special Consultant for Art and Historical Authenticity on the Palazzo de' Medici project. The position is based in Florence, effective immediately. Your responsibilities would be extensive, overseeing the entire fresco restoration, acting as the primary liaison with local historians and the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage, and serving as the final arbiter on all historical and aesthetic matters for our design team. The salary will be $250,000 per year, plus full relocation expenses and a generous housing allowance in the Oltrarno district. We will, of course, also cover the entirety of your remaining university tuition and arrange for you to complete your master's thesis with the full, unprecedented resources of the Uffizi Gallery and the Laurentian Library at your disposal." Isabella felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush, as if she had been punched. It was not a number. It was a portal to another dimension. It was a sum of money so far beyond her lived reality that it felt like a fiction, a line from a novel. It was the sudden, complete annihilation of debt. It was the end of the gnawing, sleepless fear about rent and medication and tuition. It was a first-class, one-way ticket to the city of her dreams, the living, breathing heart of the world she had dedicated her life to studying from behind the glass of library archives. It was freedom, and it was being offered to her by a man whose family had, not 30 minutes ago, treated her as if she were a piece of dirt on their shoe. The cognitive dissonance was so profound, it made her feel dizzy. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice a reedy whisper, the only sound she could produce. "Why me?" "Because you are not afraid of me," Davenport stated simply, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "Everyone in my company, from the janitors to my senior vice presidents, is afraid of me. They tell me what they think I want to hear. Their ambition has neutered their honesty. You, Miss Rossi, told me the truth, even when it was dangerous. You corrected a fool, even when that fool was my own flesh and blood. In my world and the world I operate in, that kind of courage, backed by your kind of demonstrable intellect, is worth more than a dozen MBAs from Harvard. It is the rarest commodity on earth. So, what do you say?" She looked at his expectant, unreadable face. She looked around at the opulent restaurant that had been both her livelihood and her prison. She saw the gilded door to a new life that he was holding wide open. But her mind was a whirlwind of violent conflict. Could she work for him? This ruthless, cold man who saw courage and intellect not as virtues, but as assets to be acquired and leveraged? Could she accept a future that was born directly from a moment of such profound, casual disrespect? To accept felt like a betrayal of the very dignity she had just fought to defend. I need to think about it," she said, her voice slowly regaining its strength, its resolve. Davenport did not look annoyed. Instead, he nodded slowly, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine respect appeared in his eyes. He had expected an immediate, grateful, perhaps even tearful acceptance. Her hesitation was an unexpected variable, and it intrigued him even more. "Very well," he said. "Prudence is also a valuable asset." He reached into his jacket and produced a thick, heavy business card, sliding it across the vast table. The embossed letters seemed to glow under the soft light. "Be at my office tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp. We will discuss the details. Do not be late." With that, he stood, a towering figure of immense power. He dropped a crisp $500 bill onto the table, more than enough to cover the meal and a life-changing tip, and walked out of the restaurant without a single backward glance, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. Isabella sat alone in the grand, empty booth, the business card feeling impossibly heavy, hot, as if it had been forged in a fire. The entire restaurant was staring at her, their whispers a rising tide of speculation. Marco looked as if he might faint, but the most dangerous glare of all was coming from across the room. Chloe, her face a twisted mask of incandescent rage, was watching her with the predatory stillness of a snake. As Isabella finally gathered herself and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, she began the long walk back toward the staff area. It felt like walking a gauntlet. Chloe was waiting for her, cornering her by the swinging kitchen doors. "So?" Chloe hissed, her voice a low, venomous thing, dripping with acid. "What was that all about? Did you finally offer a private tasting that wasn't on the menu?" The insinuation was vile, designed to wound and belittle, to drag this inexplicable event back down to a level of petty filth that Chloe could understand. But Isabella was too emotionally and mentally exhausted to rise to the bait. "It was a business proposition, Chloe." "A business proposition?" Chloe scoffed, her laugh sharp and humorless. Her eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, little Miss NYU, but I'm not going to let you get away with it. I've worked here for 3 years. I've earned my place. You don't just get to swan in here and—" Over the next hour, as Isabella tried to finish her shift in a complete daze, the sabotage began in earnest, a campaign of petty, vicious warfare. A full tray of champagne flutes she was carrying to a celebratory table was accidentally jostled by Chloe as she whipped around a blind corner, sending them crashing to the floor in a devastating shower of glass and expensive foam. A complex dinner order she took from a notoriously difficult food critic was mysteriously lost from the computer system, forcing her to return to the table and apologize, earning a sharp public reprimand from Marco. But the worst came when Chloe began her whispering campaign. She moved from server to server, from busboy to bartender, her head tilted conspiratorially, casting poisonous glances at Isabella, planting the seeds of a vile false rumor about how a waitress could really get a billionaire's attention. Isabella felt the atmosphere chill around her. The camaraderie of the staff, however thin, evaporated, replaced by suspicion and resentment. She was suddenly an outcast, isolated in a sea of hostile stares. It was in that moment of profound isolation that she realized, with chilling certainty, that even if she turned down Davenport's offer, her life at La Scultura was over. Chloe, consumed by a jealousy so corrosive it had become her entire personality, would make every remaining shift a living hell. The world she had known, the cage that had also been her sanctuary, was already beginning to crumble around her, its walls turning toxic. The choice was no longer just about accepting an incredible, morally complex offer. It was about escaping a place that had suddenly become untenable. The path forward was terrifying, paved with uncertainty and compromise. But the path back was now blocked by flames. The subway ride home to Queens was a surreal journey through a city that no longer looked the same. The familiar screech of the train's wheels, the blur of graffiti on tunnel walls, the weary faces of her fellow late-night commuters. It was all a muted backdrop to the roaring symphony of chaos in her mind. In her pocket, her fingers nervously traced the sharp, embossed edges of Sterling Davenport's business card. It felt less like paper and more like a talisman from another world, a key to a door she never knew existed. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary of scholarly clutter and the comforting scent of old books and chamomile tea, felt small and constricting. She found her nonna asleep in her favorite armchair, a well-worn Italian novel resting on her lap. Isabella gently tucked a blanket around the old woman's shoulders before retreating to the small kitchen. She sank onto a wobbly wooden chair, the card now lying on the table under the harsh fluorescent light. A stark black and white promise. It was the solution to every problem that kept her awake at night. It was an end to the mountain of student debt that shadowed her future. It meant no more agonizing choices between a new textbook and her grandmother's expensive heart medication. It meant she could give her nonna a life of comfort, perhaps even take her back to see Florence one last time. It was a chance to step out of the purgatory of service and into the very world she had dedicated her life to studying. It was the dream, served up on a silver platter. But the platter was tarnished. The opportunity was born from an act of cruelty. To accept it felt like a tacit endorsement of the Davenport's worldview. that everything and everyone had a price, that dignity was a commodity to be traded for a better life. Could she work for a man who represented a system she despised? Could she build her future on a foundation of such profound disrespect? Bella? A soft, raspy voice called from the other room. Is that you, tesoro mio? Isabella walked back into the living room, where her nonna was now awake, her wise, dark eyes full of concern. Nonna, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Nonsense. My old bones don't need so much sleep, she said, patting the stool beside her chair. Sit. Tell your nonna what troubles you. Your face is a storm cloud. Looking into her grandmother's face, a roadmap of a life lived with grace and hardship, Isabella felt the dam of her composure break. She told her everything: the restaurant, the Davenports, the ugly Italian words, her own shocking retort, and the impossible offer that followed. She laid the business card in her nonna's wrinkled, gentle hand. Her grandmother studied the card for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up, her eyes clear and sharp. This Tiffany, she said in Italian, is a little girl playing with sharp words she does not understand. She tried to wound you with your own heritage, with our language. And you, my Isabella, you showed her that our heritage is not a weapon for children. It is a cathedral of knowledge. You did not just speak the words, you honored them. You should be proud. But to accept his money, Nonna? To work for him? It feels dirty. Nonna Sofia took Isabella's hand. There is no shame in being paid for your mind, cara. The shame is in having a mind and letting it go to waste. This man, this Davenport, he does not see you. He sees an asset, a tool to build his hotel. Fine. Let him. You will not be a tool for his ambition. You will be a guardian for our history. You will go to Florence, the city of our family, and you will protect its beauty. You will use his money to do good work. The dirt is not on the money, Bella. The dirt is in the soul, and your soul is clean. Her nonna's words were a balm, a clarification. The path forward was not a compromise of her values, but an affirmation of them. She wouldn't be working for Sterling Davenport. She would be working for Florence, for Caravaggio, for her heritage. Davenport was simply the means, the unlikely and unpleasant patron. As dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, Isabella showered and chose her outfit with the meticulous care of a general preparing for a decisive battle. She had no corporate wardrobe, but she had a simple, well-fitting black dress, a thrift store blazer with a surprisingly elegant cut, and sensible low heels. She pulled her hair back into a sleek, professional chignon. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the tired waitress. She saw a woman who had been tested and had not been found wanting. She was terrified, but for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid. The Davenport Holdings building was a monument of glass and steel that tore a hole in the Manhattan sky, an arrogant testament to the man who built it. Its lobby was a cavernous, intimidating cathedral of polished black marble and stark white walls. The air was cool, sterile, and smelled of power. Isabella walked to the imposing front desk, her heels clicking with a soft, steady rhythm on the marble floor. Isabella Rossi, I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Davenport. The receptionist, a chic woman who looked more like a model than an administrator, gave her a brief, dismissive glance, but a quick check of the computer transformed her expression into one of professional deference. Of course, Miss Rossi. Mr. Davenport is expecting you. Express elevator to the penthouse floor. The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. As the city shrank to a toy-like map below, Isabella took a deep breath. She was not here to beg for a job. She was here to negotiate the terms of her engagement. Sterling Davenport's office was a vast corner space with panoramic views that made her feel as though she were floating over the city. He was not seated behind his massive desk in a power play, but was standing by the window looking down at the empire he commanded. Miss Rossi, he said, turning to face her. Punctual. I appreciate that. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Davenport, she began, remaining standing. I have considered your generous offer. And? His eyebrow arched. And I accept the position, she said, her voice clear and steady. However, I have some terms. If Davenport was surprised, he didn't show it. He simply gestured to a pair of leather chairs. Go on. They both sat. For the first time, they were on equal footing. First, Isabella began, our professional relationship must be one of mutual respect. My role is to be your consultant and cultural liaison, not your subordinate. I will not tolerate being spoken to in a demeaning manner by anyone in your organization, including your family. My analyses and recommendations are to be considered on their merits. Davenport listened, his expression unreadable. Second, she continued, while I will be completely dedicated to the success of this project, I am still completing my master's degree. My education is non-negotiable. I will require the flexibility to complete my thesis. And third, he prompted. Third, she finished, taking a deep breath, the salary and benefits you proposed are more than acceptable. But I want to add a clause to my contract. I want Davenport Holdings to establish a permanent endowed fellowship, the Rossi Family Fellowship for Renaissance Studies, to be awarded annually to a promising, underprivileged art history student at NYU. Your company's name will be on it. It will be excellent public relations for a developer restoring a historic landmark. She had laid her cards on the table. It was an audacious demand, one that transformed a simple employment agreement into a legacy. It forced him to not just hire her expertise, but to invest in the very world that produced it. Davenport was silent for a full minute, his steepled fingers covering his mouth as he stared at her. He had expected a negotiation over salary or vacation days. He had not expected a lecture on respect and a demand for a philanthropic legacy. He had tried to acquire an asset, and the asset was now rewriting the terms of its own acquisition. Finally, he lowered his hands and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, predatory appreciation. Miss Rossi, he said, you are more dangerous than I thought. He stood and extended a hand across the space between them. Welcome to Davenport Holdings. Have your lawyer review the contract. I'll have my foundation's director contact you about the fellowship this afternoon. As Isabella took his hand, the grip firm and dry, she knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of the most challenging and complex chapter of her life. Working with Sterling Davenport would be a daily battle of wits, a constant navigation of his formidable intellect and his ruthless ambition. 6 months later, Isabella stood on a scaffold high above the floor of the Palazzo de' Medici in Florence. The scent of old stone, dust, and turpentine filled the air. Below her, a team of Italy's finest art restorers worked with quiet reverence. She was pointing to a section of a Benozzo Gozzoli fresco, discussing the subtle pigment degradation with the lead restorer. Her Italian now not just fluent, but the nuanced language of an expert in her field. She moved with a confidence that was deep and earned. She was no longer a waitress playing a part. She was a scholar living her truth. She had earned the grudging respect of the Italian artisans, the admiration of the academics at the Uffizi, and, most surprisingly, the unwavering professional trust of Sterling Davenport. Their weekly video calls were crisp, intellectual, and devoid of condescension. He valued her results, and she delivered them. Late one afternoon, an email arrived from a colleague in New York. It contained a link to a gossip column. A small photo showed Tiffany Davenport, no longer in designer dresses, but in a drab uniform, managing the opening of a new, painfully hip coffee shop in Brooklyn, a venture her father had clearly funded to teach her some semblance of responsibility. At La Scultura, Chloe was still polishing forks, her expression permanently soured, forever complaining about the talented people who got lucky breaks she deserved. Isabella closed the laptop. She didn't feel triumph, only a quiet sense of distance. Their world was no longer her world. She looked up at the magnificent, vibrant figures on the wall, who had been waiting patiently for centuries to be seen again. She had found her place not by accepting a job, but by claiming her own worth. The waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her value in every language.